Good evening, everybody. Very nice to see you. Thank you for coming to this little oasis of peace, this breakout room from the party that's going on in the rest of the museum. Because it is a party, isn't it? And it's one part of a huge global party that's happening just now in celebration of a poet who died 700 years ago, Dante Alighieri. Famous above all for just one poem, quite a long poem, but an amazing one, which describes a vision, the experience of being transported into hell, purgatory, and paradise, which are described as a story in which the protagonist, Dante himself, and actually we then, the reader as well, are introduced to what turns out to be a giant hall of fame in which we, with Dante, encounter a series of unforgettably described individual characters who tell their own stories, each one becomes part of our own memories and lives in consequence. It's an extraordinary achievement, and it's also it's a very disconcerting one, because in this Hall of Fame it turns out that Dante must learn, and we realize that we as readers need to study and be careful and learn as well how to distinguish in this Hall of Fame between the true heroes and the monsters. It's a poem that has inspired readers and illustrators for centuries, and some of their responses from the Renaissance until the present day are on exhibit in Gallery 8 in the little exhibition called Dante, the Invention of Celebrity, which I've curated and which is there. So I hope you have a chance in the course of this amazing evening to spend a little time in the gallery, and I hope you enjoy doing that. For the time being, though, I want to suggest that we just set the poem aside and ask a different question, which is, who in any case was Dante Alighieri? And that's what I want to spend the few minutes that we have together thinking about. His prominence in the world, in Italy, in Florence, the city of his birth, have been very evident for a very long time. He's a global phenomenon now, and he's also an extremely important presence, unavoidable presence in Italy, where every city at the moment is in festa for Dante, but also and above all in Florence, where he was born, and where this statue of him was erected in the 600th anniversary of his birth in 1865, designed by Enrico Pazzi, and it stands larger than life size, dominating the Piazza Santa Croce in front of the Franciscan church there. And that presence, which, as I say, is partly a monumental one, has also been extended and repeated throughout the ages through visual imagery, of which all of us have seen examples, and which have multiplied since the later Middle Ages, since indeed the time, for example, of Botticelli, who produced a portrait of Dante in the late 15th century, which I'm showing you here. And the many, many biographies that have been written, the many lives that have been written of Dante, and they are innumerable, and some of them are very fat books, and some of them are a little less fat. This is Barbero's, this is one of the most recent, one of the flood of more books on Dante that have come out in this anniversary year. Barbero's book is a medium-sized biography of Dante, but it contains many pages, and the lives have repeatedly conveyed an impression of a man with a life story, a character, as well as a visual iconography that is recognizable. So what do we know about Dante? Well, we know that he was born in Florence. We can be This we can be pretty certain of. And visitors to Florence can visit the Casa Di Dante, which presents itself as Dante's house, the place of his birth, the epicenter, if you like, of this famous life, in the city which, ironically, however, he was banished from in 1302, spending the remaining nearly 20 years of his life in exile. But the city of Florence retains that trace of his presence, apparently here and in indeed many of the streets of the city where inscriptions and, as I've just said, monuments repeatedly remind us of his presence in the city. So we know something about that, we think. We know about his youthful love for his neighbour, Beatrice Portinari, who came from a family that lived very close to the home of the Alighieri family from which Dante stemmed. And we know from Dante's own account, in his Vita Nova, his new life, that he met Beatrice Portinari, Beatrice, when they were both 9 years old. And he tells us too that he had another very important meeting with her when they were both 18, twice 9 years old. And in the left hand of these two images by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, which he made incidentally for a piece of furniture for William Morris. Rossetti represents that meeting of the two teenaged lovers, Beatrice and Dante. And in the right-hand side you see Rossetti's representation of another meeting of the two described in Dante's later work, in his Purgatorio, when much later, after Beatrice's tragically youthful death at the age of 24, and after Dante's exile, when he came to write the Purgatorio, he wrote of the experience in his vision of meeting her again as a spirit now, a blessed spirit from paradise, who comes down to meet him in the Garden of Eden, which he finds at the top of the mountain of Purgatory. So there's these two, as it were, biographical details in that long relationship between the two, captured by Rossetti. And this further pre-Raphaelite image, very famous image by Henry Holiday, records another incident in that relationship which Dante described in his Vita Nova, when seeing Beatrice at the end of the Ponte Santa Trinita in Florence, she snubbed him because she had heard that he had not been faithful. So a rumour led her to ignore his greeting. And Holiday, who, as you can see, took great pains over the topographical accuracy of this. He travelled to Florence, he made many drawings of the old Ponte Vecchio and so on, to capture the authenticity of this scene actually happening in Florence. The historicity of it was important to readers of Dante, and as I've just said, it remains so to this day. If you treading the streets of Florence, you tread the same streets that Beatrice and Dante trod. We know also about Dante that he held public office, that he was promoted to a role in the city government, as many men of his roughly middling class were, and that he was part of an embassy representing the city of Florence to the Pope in Rome. And this too entered popular consciousness and folk memory, if you like, to the extent that, for example, the Liebig canned meat company, 100 years or so ago, could use the image of Dante mounted and just about to set off to meet the Pope in Rome and represent the city of Florence, as a means to promote its own products. Just to say that these stories, this biographical account, has become part of a wide popular consciousness. Another thing we think we know about Dante is told already in the 14th century, the century of Dante's own life, that he became so prominent in the culture of the city that, of course, he hung out with other prominent figures in the culture of Florence, notably Giotto, the painter Giotto. These two were said to have been great friends, and it was said also that Giotto had, out of friendship, wanted to include a portrait of Dante within a larger scene that he was painting, including some citizens of Florence, in the chapel of what we now call the Bargello, the palace of the Podestà, the main officer of the city of Florence. And that story remained alive as a folk memory long after the frescoes themselves had been whitewashed over. And much, much later, the story led to the rediscovery, because a rather eccentric and wonderful English man called Seymour Kirkup, who lived in Florence in the 19th century and who had gone there as an impoverished painter but stayed as a lover of, above all, Dante, actually, lived in a house on the Arno Bridge full of books and other fantastical things. Seymour Kirkup persuaded the authorities that they should take the whitewash off and find again Giotto's portrait of Dante. And they did take the whitewash off in 1840 in the chapel of the palace of the Podestà. And they found some figures, and they found this one, and it was realized they'd found Giotto's portrait of Dante. Here's the drawing of that was made on the spot at the time by Seymour Kirkup, and this was soon engraved, reproduced, disseminated, and became one of the most famous types of the image of Dante. This, not the beaky, sunken-eyed, stern prophet, which is one of the types of Dante that we all recognize. This is the youthful Dante, the romantic Dante of earlier Florentine years, supposedly. So we know of that, we think. And then after the years of exile, we know that Dante, having, as he says himself in one of his writings, lived like a pilgrim from city to city and court to court, not recognized for the genius that he was. He found his way to Ravenna, where, having completed the Paradiso, the last of the sections of his long poem, he died in 1321 on the 14th of September and was buried at the Franciscan convent there. And so around that life detail, we have the tomb, still to this day a venerable site. The tomb was elaborated in the 15th century and a little more in the 18th century. So that's how you see it now. Contains the tomb of Dante, and since the 1930s, an area around this, extending over several streets, has been designated in Dante's honor a zone of silence. So those of you who've been will know that you are told some distance before you arrive at the tomb that you're entering a zona di silenzio. So it's practically a sacred spot. This is a secular figure who, however, had become already at the time of that Enrico Pazzi statue that I showed you from 1865, 4 years into the new Kingdom of Italy, newly independent country, freed from the Austrian yoke. Dante had already become at that point the kind of secular patron saint of the new state, as he remains actually, and you see that here in the treatment of the tomb. And around the tomb too, other traces of Dante's life. Apparently we have his death mask. What a sensational thing. And this emerged also at the hands of Seymour Kirkup, who produced it towards the middle of the of the 19th century. And this was kept, this death mask, as a sacred object. Kirkup's one eventually passed to the city of Florence and is kept now as a national treasure in the Palazzo Vecchio, where you can see it framed in what's effectively a kind of reliquary. But he didn't let his version go before he made one or two copies, and he sent one to a friend in Oxford, and who was a member of the Oxford Dante Society, one of the earliest Dante societies to be founded, in 1879. And here it still is. It's in Gallery 8 at the moment, so you can see Dante's death mask. Even more sensational was the rediscovery of the bones of Dante. So we think we have his bones. This happened in 1865, and workmen had been cleaning up the tomb, which I just showed you, because there were going to be big celebrations for the 600th anniversary of Dante's birth. And somebody put a crowbar through a brick wall where was found a box labelled, "These are the bones of Dante." And it was found that the bones having been removed from the tomb that you see, and the explanation of that is that their absence from Florence had been a really frustrating problem for the Florentines, who repeatedly had tried to get the bones back for burial in Florence, and the people in Ravenna had, by various stratagems, resisted this, and at a certain point had even concealed the bones, so nobody knew quite where they were. Anyway, they were rediscovered in 1865 and put on show, and you can't see very clearly perhaps in this contemporary photograph, but a glass coffin was created within which the bones could be seen, and tens of thousands of people came to pay their respects to the bones of Dante. They were exposed one more time. They've been exposed on that occasion and once since in 1921, so 100 years ago, so therefore on the 600th anniversary of Dante's death they were exposed again. And no photography was allowed on that occasion, and no attempt to do anything with the bones was allowed, because it would seem to trivialize the lofty subject. But a young anthropologist managed to bribe guards and get in. He was determined to make a bust based on the skull that survived of Dante, and this was Fabio Frassetto, who took many measurements and then went away and created his version of what Dante really looked like, which has been cast and recast thousands of times. And this image that you see here, any Italian school child will recognize, because it's in countless school rooms, university halls, civic buildings, not just in Italy, but all around the world. Frassetto became fixated, in fact, on the head, so much so that he was making a film. He never finished it. He was making a film which was all about the head of Dante as the quintessence of European culture. Everything was contained in this head. So the idea of that Dante's true appearance would somehow give one access to the quintessence of European culture is quite a claim, isn't it? But this is the such was the desire to know what Dante really looked like, what his character was like, what his life had really been like, that all of these places, sites and images have become very familiar and are constantly recycled. And as I say, many biographies have resulted from these scraps of information. And even in Florence, where there is this rather embarrassing void, There are no bones in Florence, but nonetheless, the presence of Dante, as I say, is felt. And inside the church of Santa Croce, already in 1821, for that anniversary of his death, this magnificent late classical tomb had been created in honor of the Altissimo Poeta Dante, a really splendid and enormous tomb containing, of course, nothing. Now, despite everything I've said to you, the truth actually is that we know about Dante's life very little at all. The birthplace, yes, he was born and lived for some time in Florence. The house that we can visit, a 19th century reconstruction of a medieval building somewhere near where the Alighieri lived, is certainly, one thing it's certain, is not Dante's house. We can be sure that he lived in Florence, and we can be sure that Beatrice Portinari existed, but what Dante's relationship to Beatrice was, is a very enigmatic question. We know that he held public office, as I mentioned before, but it is barely recorded at all what role he played. It's the tiniest fragment of information about what he actually did in public life in Florence. The friendship with Giotto is a lovely idea. The dates don't correspond. They could have met later when Dante was in exile and Giotto was working in Padua. One thing for certain is that they were not in Florence working at the same time, and the so-called portrait of Dante that was so exciting and remains so exciting because of what it has come to represent, that portrait that Kirkup revealed by taking the whitewash off, is certainly not Dante, and is certainly not by Giotto either. The death mask is, as you might guess by now, is a fiction. But again, these things are very interesting, aren't they? Because of what they tell us about the desire to know the biography of the man who wrote this wonderful poem. We have wanted so much to know that we've suspended disbelief. The death mask was pretty certainly taken from a sculpture of Dante that used to be on the tomb in Ravenna and has now been lost. But it's a sculpture that was made in the late 15th century. That's the probable origin of that bust, of which we have a version, as I say, in Oxford. And it's a wonderful thing to have. I'm not saying that it's not. I think it's interesting because of this origin in a desire to know something that we absolutely do not know. We do not know what Dante looked like. And the bones, finally, although they may be authentic, and it's possible that they're authentic, remain enigmatic as well. And although this is a story I can't go into now, it's an interesting question where those bones are at this moment. They seem to have gone missing, I'm tempted to say, once more. They were to have been exposed again in September 2021, but nothing happened. And there was a story during the war of an attempt to take them to Germany, which was frustrated by their being concealed, and I'm not sure that anybody now knows where they were concealed. So there's this interesting story, then, interesting history of a desire to know Dante and an absence of knowledge, and actually, in the end, maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, it's a very interesting story, this not knowing and imagining that we know about Dante, the person. But what we do have, and what we might as well go back to, is the poem. The poem which remains, as I say, as something which has continued over the centuries and continues today to inspire artistic responses in many media, whether it's poetry, whether it's the visual arts, whether it's choreography, whether it's music. So the idea of Dante the man appeals to a persistent romantic interest in the life of the author of a great work, But in reality, Dante has frustrated our fulfillment of that interest. And rather than read, and still less write, biographies of Dante, the better thing to do is to pick up the poem and read that. Okay, thank you for your attention.